My name is Abigail Thompson. I'm 47 years old, and this Christmas morning changed everything. I watched in stunned silence as my stepmother Dolores grabbed the handmade photo album I'd spent months creating and hurled it into the snow outside our family's Georgian colonial mansion. The leather binding split open, scattering precious family memories across the frozen ground like confetti. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I secretly owned every brick of this $1.45 million estate they were so carelessly destroying my gifts on. Before we dive into this unbelievable story of family betrayal and ultimate justice, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story resonates with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life family drama stories. Trust me, what happens next will leave you speechless about how far some people will go to hurt the ones who love them most. The dysfunction in our family didn't start overnight. It began brewing 27 years ago when my father married Dolores Martinez, a calculating woman who had perfected the art of playing the victim while orchestrating every situation to her advantage. Dolores was 52 now, with perfectly maintained blonde highlights and a wardrobe that screamed expensive taste, though she constantly complained about money troubles. She brought with her a 16-year-old son from her previous marriage, Kenneth Williams, who had inherited his mother's manipulative tendencies and amplified them tenfold. Kenneth, now 35, had grown into the kind of man who measured his worth by putting others down. He possessed an uncanny ability to make everyone around him feel smaller while portraying himself as the successful family patriarch. His wife, Kristen Palmer, 32, had joined this toxic dynamic 5 years ago, bringing her own brand of entitled superiority. She had auburn hair always styled in perfect waves and a collection of designer handbags that she displayed like trophies, each one supposedly purchased with Kenneth's successful income. The three of them had created an elaborate mythology around Kenneth's supposed wealth and success. They lived in what they believed was his inherited mansion, drove cars they assumed he could afford, and maintained a lifestyle that impressed their social circle. The truth was far more complicated and far more devastating to their carefully constructed image. What they didn't realize was that their entire lifestyle was built on a foundation of lies. 5 years earlier, when my father's estate went through probate, the family had faced potential foreclosure due to outstanding debts and tax liens. While Kenneth and Dolores panicked and argued about selling the family home, I had quietly purchased the property through my consulting firm's LLC for $1.45 million, using a combination of my savings and a business loan. The deed was in my name, the mortgage payments came from my account, and the property taxes were paid through my company. But I had never told them. I had spent decades being treated as the family failure, the unmarried daughter who couldn't quite get her life together, the one who was tolerated rather than celebrated. They saw me as someone who needed their charity, their grudging acceptance, their occasional crumbs of acknowledgement. In their version of our family story, Kenneth was the golden child who had inherited their father's business acumen, while I was the disappointment who had never quite measured up to expectations. The irony was suffocating. While Kenneth struggled to maintain his sales position at a mid-tier insurance company and Dolores worked part-time at a boutique to maintain appearances, I had built a thriving cybersecurity consulting firm that generated substantial revenue. My expertise in protecting businesses from digital threats had made me financially independent, but I had learned early that sharing good news in our family only invited resentment and attempts to diminish my achievements. Their first major attack came during Christmas dinner, delivered with the casual cruelty that had become their signature. Kenneth pushed back from the table, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used when making pronouncements about family decisions. "Abigail, Kristen and I have been talking, and we think it's time you started planning for your future." His words carried an undertone of finality that made my stomach clench. Dolores nodded supportively, her expression a perfect blend of concern and condescension. "We've been more than generous letting you stay here all these years, but Kenneth has his own family to think about now." She gestured toward Kristen, who smiled with practiced sympathy while her eyes remained cold and calculating. Kristen leaned forward, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "We're not trying to be mean, but this house is really meant for a growing family. Kenneth and I are planning to start having children soon, and we'll need the extra space." The implication was clear. I was taking up room that rightfully belonged to people who mattered more. Kenneth's next words hit like a physical blow. "We're giving you until New Year's to figure out your living situation." That's more than generous, considering most people would have handled this differently years ago. The casual cruelty in his voice revealed how thoroughly he had convinced himself that he was being magnanimous rather than heartless. As I sat there listening to them plan my eviction from my own home, I felt something fundamental shift inside me. The years of swallowing their insults, accepting their version of reality, and prioritizing family peace over my own dignity had reached their limit. But I wasn't ready to reveal the truth yet. I needed to see just how far they were willing to go with their cruelty before I showed them exactly who held the real power in our family dynamic. What my family didn't know could have filled libraries. While they saw me as struggling and dependent, I had quietly built one of the most successful cybersecurity consulting firms in our region. Thompson Digital Security had grown from my spare bedroom operation into a company with 12 employees and annual revenues exceeding $300,000. My expertise in protecting businesses from ransomware attacks, data breaches, and digital espionage had made me indispensable to companies across multiple industries. The business had grown organically through referrals and reputation rather than flashy marketing or family connections. I specialized in helping small to medium-sized businesses protect themselves from increasingly sophisticated cyber threats, and my success rate had earned me a reputation that commanded premium fees. While Kenneth struggled to meet his monthly quotas selling insurance policies, I was consulting with bank presidents, hospital administrators, and manufacturing executives about protecting their most sensitive information. My financial portfolio reflected years of careful planning and smart investments. Beyond the cybersecurity firm, I owned 2 rental properties in desirable neighborhoods, maintained a substantial emergency fund, and had diversified investment accounts that continued growing steadily. The monthly income from my various revenue streams exceeded what Kenneth made in 6 months, yet they remained completely oblivious to my actual financial situation. The purchase of our family home had been both an emotional and strategic decision. 5 years ago, when my father passed away suddenly from a heart attack, his estate had been smaller than anyone expected. Medical bills, outstanding business debts, and accumulated tax liens had consumed most of his assets. The house, which had been in our family for 2 generations, faced immediate foreclosure. While Kenneth and Dolores argued about whether to sell or fight the creditors, I had acted decisively. Working with my business attorney Harold Gibson, I had structured the purchase through my consulting firm's holding company. The transaction appeared to outside observers as a straightforward business acquisition, with the property being purchased by Thompson Holdings LLC for $1.45 million. The mortgage payments, property taxes, insurance premiums, and maintenance costs all flowed through my business accounts, creating a clear paper trail that established my ownership beyond any possible dispute. But I had made a critical decision to keep this information private. My reasoning had seemed sound at the time. Revealing my ownership would have created family drama and potentially damaged relationships that I was hoping could be repaired over time. I had convinced myself that maintaining family harmony was worth more than claiming credit for saving our ancestral home. That decision looked increasingly naive as the years passed. Instead of gratitude for my discretion, I received contempt for my apparent dependence. Instead of recognition for my sacrifice, I got lectures about personal responsibility and financial independence. The very people whose stability I had quietly ensured were now treating me as a burden they needed to shed. My best friend and business partner Diana Martinez had been urging me for months to stop enabling their delusions. Diana, a sharp-minded attorney who specialized in corporate law, had watched our family dynamics with growing frustration. "You're not protecting them by letting them live in ignorance," she had argued during one of our regular coffee meetings. "You're protecting yourself from having to deal with their reactions, but that protection comes at the cost of your own dignity." Diana had been instrumental in structuring my business growth and had witnessed firsthand how my family's treatment affected my confidence and decision-making. She understood better than anyone how their constant criticism had shaped my tendency to minimize my own achievements and avoid confrontation. But she had also seen my professional competence and leadership skills, which made the contrast with my family behavior even more stark. The second attack came 3 days after Christmas, delivered with Kenneth's characteristic blend of authority and contempt. He had called a family meeting, a formal gathering that typically preceded his most important announcements. Seated at the head of our dining room table like a corporate executive addressing subordinates, he cleared his throat and began speaking with ceremonial gravity. "I've been doing some serious thinking about our family's future, and I've made some important decisions." His tone suggested that these decisions were both final and beneficial for everyone involved. "Kristen and I have decided that this house is too big for our current needs, and the maintenance costs are becoming prohibitive." Dolores nodded approvingly, though her expression suggested she had been briefed on this announcement in advance. "Kenneth has been carrying the financial burden of this property for too long," she added, her voice carrying the weight of assumed sacrifice. "It's time to make some practical changes." Kenneth's next words revealed the true scope of their planning. "We're going to be putting the house on the market within the next month. The real estate agent thinks we can get at least $2 million for it, maybe more if we're patient." He paused, letting the implications sink in before delivering the final blow. "Abigail, this means you'll need to expedite your moving timeline. We can't have potential buyers seeing the house as occupied by extended family." The casual cruelty of reducing me to extended family in my own home was breathtaking. But what struck me even more was their complete confidence in their authority to make these decisions. They weren't asking for my opinion or input, they were informing me of choices that had already been made about property they didn't own and couldn't legally sell. As I listened to them discuss listing prices, staging strategies, and closing timelines, I realized that my patience with their ignorance had reached its absolute limit. They weren't just planning to evict me from my own home, they were planning to sell it and profit from my investment. The time for protecting their feelings and maintaining family peace had officially ended. The New Year's ultimatum arrived with military precision and devastating personal cruelty. Kenneth had clearly spent time planning his approach, choosing the family's annual New Year's Eve gathering as a stage for maximum humiliation. He waited until we had assembled in the living room, drinks in hand and the atmosphere relaxed, before launching into what could only be described as a calculated character assassination disguised as family concern. "Since we're starting a new year, I think it's time for some honest family conversation," Kenneth began, his tone suggesting both reluctance and necessity. "Abigail, your situation has become unsustainable, and continuing to enable your dependence isn't helping anyone." The word dependence hit like a slap, particularly coming from someone whose every comfort was funded by my silent sacrifice. Dolores leaned forward with practiced sympathy, her expression suggesting deep maternal concern. "We've all tried to be supportive, but there comes a point where kindness becomes enabling." She paused dramatically before delivering her verdict. "You're 47 years old, and you're still living like a teenager in your childhood bedroom." Kristen, emboldened by the unified front, added her own observations with surgical precision. "Kenneth and I have been talking about starting our family, and we need to think about creating a stable, adult environment for children." The implication that my presence somehow represented instability or childishness was both insulting and ironically hypocritical. Kenneth then revealed the scope of their coordination and planning. "We've arranged for you to view several affordable apartments next week. Nothing fancy, but clean places that should fit within whatever budget you can manage." His tone suggested magnanimous assistance rather than forced eviction, as if they were doing me a favor by organizing my displacement from my own property. The cruelest element was their timing and audience. They had invited my Uncle Robert and Aunt Helen, along with several family friends, ostensibly for a casual New Year's celebration. But their announcement about my housing situation turned the gathering into a public humiliation designed to make any resistance on my part appear unreasonable or ungrateful. Kenneth has been more than generous supporting extended family, Robert observed, clearly having been briefed on the family's version of events. But a man has to think about his own household first. His words stung because they reflected how successfully Kenneth and Dolores had rewritten our family's financial history. Helen nodded sympathetically while studying me with obvious pity. Maybe this transition will be good for you, dear. Independence can be empowering at any age. Her well-meaning encouragement felt like salt in wounds that were already raw from years of accumulated slights and deliberate misrepresentations. The third attack came in the form of social orchestration designed to isolate me from any potential support systems. Over the following week, I discovered that Kenneth had been systematically contacting family friends, neighbors, and distant relatives to share his version of my situation. His narrative portrayed him as a reluctant but responsible family head forced to make difficult decisions about an unstable sister who had become too dependent on his generosity. The conversations followed a predictable pattern, as I learned from Diana, who had heard variations of the story from multiple sources within our shared professional network. Kenneth would begin by expressing concern about my inability to launch, despite his years of support. He would then detail the sacrifices he and Kristen had made to accommodate my presence in their home, emphasizing their patience with my emotional difficulties and financial struggles. Most damaging was his suggestion that my resistance to moving out demonstrated concerning mental health issues that required family intervention. "We're worried about her stability," became his standard phrase, delivered with just enough reluctance to sound credible rather than vindictive. The implication was that forced independence might shock me into taking responsibility for my life. Meanwhile, my internal struggle reached new levels of intensity as I watched them destroy relationships and reputations I had spent years building. My natural inclination toward family loyalty warred with growing recognition that their behavior had crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Every day I delayed revealing the truth gave them more time to spread their poisonous narrative and potentially create legal complications for any future resolution. Diana had begun pressing me more aggressively about taking action. During our emergency meeting on January 3rd, she pulled out documents I had asked her to prepare months earlier but had never authorized her to use. "These ownership papers don't get more valid with age," she said, spreading the deed and mortgage documents across her office table. "Every day you wait gives them more time to establish their false narrative." Her legal mind had already identified the potential complications of my prolonged silence. "If they succeed in portraying you as mentally unstable or financially dependent, it could complicate any future legal proceedings," she warned. "Judges don't look favorably on people who allow deception to continue when they have the power to stop it." But perhaps most importantly, Diana had begun documenting the systematic nature of their emotional abuse. "What they're doing to you meets clinical definitions of gaslighting and financial abuse," she explained, referring to notes she had been keeping about our conversations. "Your ownership of the property makes their behavior even more legally problematic." The fourth attack came on January 7th, when Dolores took the dramatic step of changing the locks on what she believed was Kenneth's house. I returned from a business meeting to find my keys no longer worked and my personal belongings piled in garbage bags on the front porch. The symbolism was unmistakable. I was being treated as unwanted trash to be disposed of as quickly and efficiently as possible. But Dolores had made a critical tactical error in her eagerness to humiliate me. The lock change constituted illegal eviction under state tenant protection laws, regardless of who owned the property. More importantly, it represented criminal trespass and destruction of property when performed on a residence I actually owned. Her action had transformed their emotional abuse into clear legal violations that could be prosecuted under multiple statutes. Standing on my own front porch, looking at my belongings scattered in garbage bags like discarded refuse, I felt the last vestiges of family loyalty finally die. They had moved beyond emotional cruelty into criminal behavior, and their actions demanded a response that would permanently alter our family dynamic. The time for patience and diplomacy had ended. The time for legal consequences had officially begun. As I loaded my belongings into my car, knowing I could return whenever I chose because I held the deed, I began planning their education about the actual power structure in our family. They had spent years believing themselves superior while living off my generosity. Now they would learn exactly how much their comfortable lives had depended on my continued silence about reality. The systematic destruction of my reputation began within hours of the lock change incident and demonstrated a level of coordination that revealed how long Kenneth, Dolores, and Kristen had been planning their campaign. They had clearly anticipated that I might resist their eviction and had prepared multiple strategies to make any challenge appear irrational or vindictive. The fifth attack came through social media, where Kristen had crafted a series of posts designed to appear supportive while actually maximizing damage to my credibility. Her Instagram story featured a carefully staged photo of Kenneth and Dolores looking concerned and exhausted, accompanied by text that read, "Sometimes loving someone means making tough decisions for their own good. Prayers needed for family healing during difficult transitions." The post garnered dozens of sympathetic comments from friends who didn't understand the context but wanted to offer support during what appeared to be a family crisis. Each expression of concern for Kenneth and Kristen's difficult situation reinforced their narrative while positioning me as the problem requiring intervention rather than the victim of coordinated abuse. But Kristen's most damaging post came later that week, featuring a photo of my belongings in garbage bags with the caption, "Cleaning out toxic energy to make room for new blessings." Sometimes you have to choose your peace over people's feelings. The image of my personal possessions treated as refuse was humiliating enough, but the implication that I represented toxic energy was designed to poison relationships throughout our social network. Kenneth's approach was more subtle but equally destructive. He began a series of concerned phone calls to business associates, neighbors, and family friends, ostensibly seeking advice about how to help a sister experiencing mental health difficulties. His conversations followed a careful script designed to plant seeds of doubt about my stability while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. "I'm really worried about Abigail," became his standard opening line, delivered with just the right amount of reluctance and concern. "She's been struggling since Dad died, and we've been trying to help, but she seems to be getting worse instead of better." He would then describe my resistance to their housing timeline as evidence of deteriorating judgment and inability to face reality. Most devastating was his suggestion that my business success might be exaggerated or unsustainable. "She talks about having this consulting company, but we never see evidence of real income," he would confide to listeners who had no access to my actual financial information. "We're starting to wonder if she's been living in some kind of fantasy world about her professional situation." The rumor campaign spread through our community with viral efficiency, helped by the fact that I had maintained privacy about my business operations and financial situation. My discreet lifestyle, which I had chosen to avoid family resentment, now worked against me as people had no contrary evidence to challenge Kenneth's narrative. Diana witnessed the damage firsthand when several potential clients mentioned concerns about my family situation during preliminary discussions about cybersecurity contracts. "People are worried about your stability," she reported after a particularly frustrating week of damaged business relationships. "Kenneth's campaign is affecting your professional reputation in ways that could take years to repair." The community isolation became apparent during my first public appearance after the eviction, when I attended our neighborhood association meeting. Conversations stopped when I entered the room, and people who had been friendly for years now greeted me with awkward sympathy. Their expressions suggested they viewed me as someone experiencing a mental health crisis rather than a victim of family abuse. Margaret Foster, a longtime neighbor who had always been cordial, approached me with the kind of careful concern typically reserved for potentially unstable individuals. "How are you holding up, dear?" she asked, her tone suggesting she expected a breakdown rather than a normal conversation. "Kenneth mentioned you've been having some difficulties adjusting to changes." Even worse was the conversation with David Chin, a local business owner who had previously expressed interest in my cybersecurity services. I heard about your family situation, he said carefully, and I want you to know that if you need some time to get your personal life sorted out, there's no pressure about the consultation we discussed. The implication that my family's lies might cost me professional opportunities was infuriating, but also strategically useful. Their overreach was creating documentation of deliberate harm to my reputation and livelihood, which would strengthen any future legal response to their campaign of defamation. The most outrageous attack came when Kenneth contacted the police to report my car as potentially stolen. His claim was that I had taken the vehicle without permission when I moved out, and he was concerned about my mental state making me a danger to myself or others. The report was completely false, as the car was titled in my name and financed through my business account, but it created an official record that supported his narrative of my instability. The police visit to my temporary hotel room was professionally handled, but personally humiliating. Officer Jennifer Rodriguez was courteous, but thorough in her questioning about my living situation, employment status, and family relationships. Her inquiries made clear that Kenneth had painted a picture of someone experiencing a psychotic break rather than a property dispute. Your brother seems genuinely concerned about your welfare, Officer Rodriguez explained as she reviewed my identification and vehicle registration. He mentioned that you've been resistant to accepting help from family members. Her tone suggested she was trying to determine whether I needed mental health intervention rather than investigating a false police report. Proving ownership of my car required producing registration documents, insurance papers, and loan documentation that clearly established my legal right to the vehicle. But the damage was done in terms of creating an official record of family concern about my mental state, which could be referenced in future interactions with authorities or legal proceedings. As I sat in my hotel room that evening, surrounded by evidence of my actual financial stability and professional success, I realized that my family's campaign had crossed every possible line. They weren't just trying to evict me from my own home. They were systematically destroying my reputation, damaging my business relationships, and creating false official records that portrayed me as mentally unstable. Diana arrived within hours of my call, carrying legal documents and wearing the expression of an attorney who had reached the limits of patience with client indecision. They've moved beyond family drama into criminal territory, she announced, spreading evidence across the hotel desk. Defamation, illegal eviction, filing false police reports, and intentional interference with business relationships. Her legal analysis was devastating for Kenneth and Dolores. Every conversation, every social media post, every false report creates additional liability for damages, she explained. But more importantly, they've established a pattern of coordinated harassment that judges take very seriously. The documentation she had been quietly compiling would demonstrate the systematic nature of their campaign rather than isolated incidents. Looking at the evidence of their coordinated attack on every aspect of my life, I finally understood that my desire to preserve family relationships had been naive from the beginning. They had never viewed me as family worth protecting. I had been a resource to exploit and a scapegoat to blame when convenient. The time for defensive reactions had ended. The time for strategic offense had begun. Harold Gibson's law office reflected the kind of understated competence that comes from 40 years of property law practice and successful resolution of complex family disputes. When Diana and I arrived for our emergency consultation, Harold's expression suggested he had already reviewed our documentation and reached preliminary conclusions about both the legal merits and strategic implications of our situation. Mrs. Thompson, your family has created what we call a target-rich environment for legal action, Harold began, spreading our ownership documents across his conference table. Their behavior violates multiple statutes, and their complete ignorance of your actual position makes them legally vulnerable in ways they clearly don't understand. Harold's analysis was methodical and devastating. The property deed, mortgage documents, tax payments, and insurance records created an unbreakable chain of evidence establishing my ownership. More importantly, The documentation showed continuous payment of all property-related expenses for 5 years, which strengthened my legal position beyond any possible challenge. The lock change alone constitutes criminal trespass and illegal eviction, Harold explained, referring to photographs Diana had taken of my belongings scattered on the porch. But combined with their defamation campaign and false police reports, we're looking at multiple felony charges if we choose to pursue criminal prosecution. But Harold's recommendation focused on civil rather than criminal remedies, at least initially. Criminal charges would take months to resolve and might actually generate sympathy for them as elderly defendants, he reasoned. Civil action will be faster, more comprehensive, and ultimately more satisfying for your purposes. Our first strategic decision involved timing and documentation. Rather than immediately revealing my ownership through direct confrontation, Harold recommended serving legal papers that would force them to discover their vulnerability through official channels. Let them learn about their situation from court officers rather than family conversation, he suggested. It's more dramatic and legally cleaner. The papers Harold prepared were comprehensive and unforgiving. The primary document was an unlawful detainer action that formally notified Kenneth, Dolores, and Kristen that they were trespassing on private property and demanded their immediate vacation of the premises. The second document was a demand for 5 years of back rent totaling $180,000, calculated at market rates for comparable properties. Additional documents included cease and desist orders regarding their defamation campaign, demands for removal of false social media posts, and formal notice of our intention to pursue damages for interference with business relationships. Each paper was designed to demonstrate the scope of their legal exposure while offering opportunities for settlement that would minimize their financial destruction. The beauty of this approach, Harold explained, is that it forces them to obtain legal representation and discover through their own attorney just how thoroughly they've destroyed their position. He handed me copies of all documents, each one representing a strategic chess move in what had become a complex legal battle. Diana coordinated the service of papers to ensure maximum impact and minimum opportunity for coordination between the defendants. Kenneth received his papers at his workplace during a busy afternoon, ensuring his professional embarrassment while preventing him from immediately contacting Dolores and Kristen to coordinate their response. The process server's report described Kenneth's reaction as progressing through distinct stages of disbelief, confusion, and growing panic as he read through the documentation. His initial dismissive attitude had transformed into obvious distress by the time he finished reviewing the ownership evidence and financial demands. Dolores received her papers at the boutique where she worked part-time, surrounded by customers and coworkers who witnessed her complete breakdown upon reading the documents. According to the process server, she had begun hyperventilating and required assistance from paramedics who were called when she appeared to be having a panic attack. Kristen's reaction was the most satisfying, as she received her papers during a social gathering at our country club, surrounded by the very people to whom she had been spreading stories about my instability and dependence. The public nature of the service ensured that her social network immediately learned about the true nature of our family dispute. The community response was swift and merciless. Within hours of the papers being served, neighbors began contacting Diana's office requesting clarification about the ownership situation. Several people who had received Kenneth's concerned phone calls about my mental health now understood they had been manipulated into supporting a family fraud. Margaret Foster called personally to apologize for her previous awkwardness and to express outrage about being deceived. "I feel like such a fool for believing Kenneth's stories about supporting you," she said, her voice carrying genuine anger about being used in their campaign. "If we had known the truth, we would have been supporting you instead of enabling their lies." The business community reaction was equally strong, as word spread that the unstable sister they had heard about was actually a successful business owner who had been systematically abused by family members living off her generosity. Several potential clients who had been hesitant due to Kenneth's rumors now contacted my office directly to discuss postponed projects. David Chin sent a formal letter apologizing for his previous hesitation and requesting immediate consultation about cybersecurity upgrades for his business. "I should have known better than to make professional decisions based on family gossip," he wrote. "Your reputation in the business community should have been sufficient evidence of your competence and stability." Kenneth's desperate response revealed the complete collapse of his confident facade. Within 24 hours of receiving the legal papers, he had contacted 3 different attorneys seeking representation for what he still believed was a frivolous lawsuit by a mentally unstable sister. Each attorney had reached the same conclusion after reviewing the documentation. His position was legally indefensible and financially catastrophic. Bradford Wellington, the expensive attorney Kenneth eventually hired, delivered the devastating news during their first consultation. According to Diana's sources within the legal community, Bradford's assessment was brutally honest about Kenneth's exposure and limited options for defense. "Mr. Williams, your sister owns the house," Bradford had reportedly stated without diplomatic preamble. "She has owned it for 5 years, she has paid all expenses, and she has clear legal authority to evict you immediately." The attorney's follow-up analysis was equally devastating. "Your actions constitute multiple violations of tenant protection laws, property rights, and defamation statutes." Bradford's bill for reviewing the case and delivering this assessment was $15,000, money Kenneth didn't have and couldn't realistically obtain given his actual financial situation. The irony was perfect. His attempt to portray wealth and authority had led him to hire representation he couldn't afford to fight a case he couldn't win. Dolores's response was predictably dramatic and strategically useless. She began calling distant relatives and family friends, seeking emotional support and financial assistance for what she portrayed as a legal attack by an ungrateful daughter. Her calls revealed the depth of her delusion about both her legal position and her social standing within the extended family. Uncle Robert's conversation with Dolores became community knowledge when he shared details with multiple family members. Dolores called crying about Abigail suing them for the house, he reported, but when I asked her about the ownership documents, she couldn't explain them at all. His conclusion was damaging. "It sounds like Abigail has been supporting them financially while they treated her like a charity case." As the first week of legal proceedings concluded, the transformation in community perception was complete and irreversible. Kenneth, who had spent years positioning himself as the successful family leader, was now known as someone who had lived off his sister's generosity while systematically abusing her. Dolores, who had cultivated an image of gracious family matriarch, was Rev. Bradford Wellington's legal strategy reflected the desperation of clients with indefensible positions and insufficient resources to mount effective resistance. His approach combined aggressive procedural challenges with character assassination, hoping to create enough confusion and delay to force a settlement that would minimize his client's exposure to devastating financial judgment. The family's first desperate countermove involved challenging my ownership through claims of undue influence and elder abuse. Bradford filed motions alleging that I had manipulated my dying father into changing his estate plans, taking advantage of his diminished mental capacity to fraudulently obtain property that should have passed to Kenneth as the eldest son. The allegations were both legally baseless and personally devastating in their calculated cruelty. Bradford's filings suggested that my father's decision to sell me the house had been the result of psychological manipulation rather than love and trust. The documents portrayed me as a predatory daughter who had exploited parental affection for financial gain while excluding other family members from their rightful inheritance. Kenneth's sworn affidavit claimed that our father had been showing signs of cognitive decline before his death and that my influence over his decisions had been concerning and inappropriate. The document alleged that I had isolated our father from other family members while pressuring him to make financial decisions that benefited only me. Dolores's affidavit focused on emotional manipulation, claiming that I had used my unmarried status and apparent financial struggles to generate sympathy from a father who felt guilty about remarrying. Her statement suggested that my father's decision to sell me the house had been motivated by misplaced paternal guilt rather than sound business judgment. Most outrageously, Kristen's affidavit alleged that I had made threats against family members who questioned my growing influence over our father's finances. Her statement claimed that my behavior had become increasingly erratic and controlling in the months before his death, culminating in property transfers that excluded rightful heirs. Harold's response to these allegations was swift and devastatingly comprehensive. His investigative team had gathered medical records, attorney testimonials, and witness statements that completely demolished their claims of elder abuse or undue influence. The evidence showed that our father had been mentally sharp until his final hospitalization, and that his decision to sell me the house had been carefully considered and properly documented. Dr. Patricia Sullivan, our father's primary care physician, provided a sworn statement confirming that he had shown no signs of cognitive impairment during their regular visits leading up to his death. Mr. Thompson was mentally acute and fully capable of making complex financial decisions, her statement read. His concerns about family dynamics were realistic and well-founded. Harold Gibson himself provided testimony about the house purchase, describing multiple meetings where our father had expressed gratitude for my willingness to preserve the family property, while other family members had suggested selling it to pay debts. Mr. Thompson was proud of his daughter's business success and relieved that she could prevent foreclosure, Harold's statement explained. But the most damaging evidence came from our father's own words, recorded in medical records and attorney files that Bradford's team had apparently never bothered to investigate. Multiple healthcare providers had documented conversations where our father expressed frustration with Kenneth's financial irresponsibility and gratitude for my support during his final illness. The sixth attack came through attempted asset freezing, as Bradford sought court orders to prevent me from disposing of property or business assets while their challenges were pending. The motion portrayed me as a flight risk who might attempt to hide assets obtained through fraudulent means, requiring judicial intervention to protect the rightful heirs' interests. Bradford's team had clearly hoped that aggressive legal maneuvering would pressure me into a settlement that would allow Kenneth and Dolores to remain in the house while making minimal financial concessions. Their strategy assumed that I would prefer to avoid extended litigation even if my legal position was strong. But Harold's counter-response revealed the fundamental weakness in their approach. Our evidence was so comprehensive and their position so legally indefensible that aggressive tactics only highlighted their desperation. Every motion they filed provided opportunities for Harold to introduce additional evidence of their bad faith and malicious behavior. The asset freezing motion failed completely when Harold demonstrated that all my property and business assets had been legitimately acquired through documented business activities. Bank records, tax returns, and client contracts created an unbreakable trail showing the growth of my consulting firm and the source of funds used to purchase the house. Judge Patricia Morrison's ruling on the asset motion was particularly devastating for Bradford's clients. The court finds no credible evidence supporting allegations of fraudulent asset acquisition, her order stated. The defendant's motion appears designed to harass the plaintiff rather than protect legitimate interests. Meanwhile, their media manipulation campaign backfired spectacularly as local news outlets began investigating the story Kenneth had pitched about sibling property theft. Reporter Michelle Davis had initially been sympathetic to Kenneth's narrative about family betrayal, but changed her approach after reviewing public property records and interviewing community members. The newspaper article that resulted from Michelle's investigation was headlined, "Local Business Owner Defends Property Rights Against Family Claims," and told a completely different story than Kenneth had intended. The piece portrayed me as a successful entrepreneur whose generosity had been repaid with abuse and false accusations. Thompson Digital Security has an excellent reputation in the business community, the article noted, and property records clearly show that a mess. Thompson purchased the family home through legitimate means 5 years ago. The story quoted several business leaders who praised my professional competence and expressed shock at learning about my family's treatment. Kenneth's reaction to the article was both predictable and self-destructive. He contacted the newspaper claiming bias and demanding corrections, but his complaints only drew additional attention to the story. His angry phone calls to the editor revealed his continued refusal to accept reality about the ownership situation and his inability to understand how thoroughly his position had collapsed. The seventh and final attack came through Kristen's false police reports claiming that I had made threatening phone calls and appeared at the house in violation of restraining orders that didn't actually exist. Her reports portrayed me as an unstable individual whose anger about family decisions had escalated into criminal behavior. Officer Jennifer Rodriguez, who had handled the previous false vehicle theft report, was assigned to investigate Kristen's new allegations. But this time her approach was more skeptical, as the previous investigation had revealed the questionable reliability of my family's claims about my mental state and behavior. Mrs. Williams, your previous statements about Ms. Thompson have proven to be inaccurate, Officer Rodriguez noted during her interview with Kristen. I'm going to need very specific evidence to support these new allegations. Her professional skepticism reflected growing awareness within the police department that my family was misusing law enforcement resources. Kristen's inability to provide corroborating evidence for her claims, combined with phone records showing no threatening calls and security footage proving I hadn't been near the house, resulted in her being warned about filing false police reports. The incident created an official record of her dishonesty that would be useful in future legal proceedings. But perhaps most satisfying was the growing recognition throughout our community that Kenneth, Dolores, and Kristen had been systematically lying about their circumstances for years. Neighbors who had envied Kenneth's apparent success now understood that his lifestyle had been funded by someone he had treated as a family burden. Friends who had admired Dolores's gracious hosting realized that her entertaining had been subsidized by a daughter she had repeatedly humiliated. As Harold prepared for the next phase of our legal strategy, the complete failure of their counterattack had eliminated any possibility of negotiated settlement. Their false allegations had backfired so thoroughly that they now faced additional liability for malicious prosecution and abuse of legal process. The education they had forced upon themselves was about to become far more expensive and permanent than they could have imagined. The courtroom proceedings began with Judge Patricia Morrison's preliminary review of all filed documents, and her expression suggested that she had already reached tentative conclusions about the legal merits and credibility of the various parties. Harold had requested an expedited hearing due to the clear nature of the ownership evidence and the ongoing harm caused by the defendant's occupation of my property. Bradford Wellington's opening statement revealed the desperation of his position, as he attempted to construct a narrative that could somehow justify 5 years of rent-free occupation of property his clients didn't own. His argument centered on alleged family agreements and expectations that supposedly gave Kenneth permanent residency rights, regardless of legal ownership. Your Honor, this case involves more than simple property law, Bradford began, his tone suggesting complexity where none actually existed. The defendants have been living in this family home for years based on reasonable expectations about inheritance and family obligations that transcend mere legal technicalities. But Harold's response was devastating in its simplicity and factual precision. Your Honor, this case involves straightforward property ownership, illegal eviction, and systematic defamation by tenants who have lived rent-free for 5 years while abusing their landlord. He presented our evidence methodically, building an unassailable foundation of documentary proof. The property deed, mortgage documents, and 5 years of payment records created a timeline that no amount of legal maneuvering could challenge. More importantly, the evidence showed continuous financial responsibility for every aspect of property ownership, from major renovations to routine maintenance costs, all funded through my business accounts. Kenneth's testimony under oath revealed the complete collapse of his confident facade and the extent of his delusions about family finances. When Harold questioned him about his understanding of property ownership, Kenneth's answers demonstrated willful ignorance rather than innocent confusion. I always assumed the house belonged to the family, Kenneth testified, his voice lacking its usual authority. My mother married into this family, and I grew up thinking that made it our home regardless of legal paperwork. His reasoning revealed childlike thinking about complex property law and financial responsibility. But Harold's follow-up questions exposed the deliberate nature of Kenneth's ignorance. Mr. Williams, did you ever wonder who is paying the property taxes, insurance premiums, and major repair costs? The question forced Kenneth to admit that he had never contributed to any property-related expenses while living there for 5 years. Kenneth's attempt to claim ignorance about the source of funding for household expenses became increasingly unconvincing as Harold presented bank records showing mortgage payments, utility bills, and maintenance costs all traced to my business accounts. You're saying you never questioned where $30,000 annually in property expenses was coming from? Dolores's testimony was even more damaging to their case, as her emotional defensiveness revealed the calculated nature of her treatment of me over the years. Her attempts to portray herself as a concerned stepmother were undermined by evidence of her systematic efforts to undermine my reputation and relationships. Mrs. Martinez, you filed police reports claiming Ms. Thompson had stolen property and made threatening phone calls, Harold noted, referring to documented false reports. Were these reports based on actual incidents, or were they part of a campaign to portray her as mentally unstable? Dolores's response revealed her continued belief that emotional manipulation could substitute for legal arguments. I was worried about her behavior and thought the police should know about our concerns, she testified, apparently unaware that admitting to filing false reports created additional legal liability. But the most devastating testimony came from Kristen, whose social media activities and public statements had created extensive documentation of their coordinated defamation campaign. Harold's presentation of her Instagram posts, Facebook comments, and recorded conversations revealed the systematic nature of their attack on my reputation. Mrs. Williams, this post shows a photograph of Ms. Thompson's personal belongings in garbage bags with text calling them toxic energy, Harold noted, displaying the evidence for the court. Can you explain why you felt it appropriate to publicly humiliate someone whose generosity had been funding your lifestyle? Kristen's attempt to claim that her posts were about general life philosophy rather than specific attacks on me became laughable when Harold showed the timeline correlation between her social media activity and their family meetings about my eviction. Her documented malice eliminated any possibility of claiming innocent misunderstanding. The testimony phase concluded with character witnesses who destroyed any remaining credibility the defendants might have maintained. Diana's professional assessment of my business competence provided stark contrast to their portrayal of me as financially struggling and mentally unstable. Ms. Thompson runs one of the most successful cybersecurity consulting firms in our region, Diana testified. Her annual income exceeds what most people earn in several years, and her professional reputation is impeccable. Her testimony established the complete falseness of Kenneth's claims about my financial dependence. Dr. Patricia Sullivan's medical testimony eliminated their elder abuse allegations entirely. Mr. Thompson was mentally sharp and emotionally stable throughout his final illness, she testified. His decision to sell the house to his daughter was logical and well-reasoned, given the family's financial circumstances. But perhaps most powerful was Harold Gibson's own testimony about our father's state of mind during the property transaction. Mr. Thompson expressed relief that his daughter could preserve the family home while other family members suggested selling it to pay debts, Harold testified. He was proud of her business success and grateful for her willingness to take on the financial burden. Judge Morrison's ruling was comprehensive and unforgiving, addressing both the immediate property dispute and the broader pattern of abuse that had characterized my family's behavior. Her written decision became a matter of public record that permanently established the truth about our family dynamics. The court finds that defendants have occupied plaintiff's property for 5 years without payment of rent, utilities, or property-related expenses, Judge Morrison wrote. More seriously, defendants have engaged in systematic defamation and harassment designed to conceal their financial dependence while portraying the victim as mentally unstable. The judge's analysis of their false police reports and social media campaign was particularly devastating. Defendants' conduct represents a coordinated effort to destroy plaintiff's reputation and business relationships through deliberate falsehoods, the decision continued. Such behavior cannot be excused as family disagreement and constitutes actionable defamation. Judge Morrison's final paragraph eliminated any possibility of appeal or further delay. The evidence establishes plaintiff's ownership beyond any reasonable dispute and demonstrates defendants' bad faith throughout these proceedings, she concluded. Defendants will vacate the premises within 30 days and pay all outstanding obligations, as detailed in the attached judgment. As we left the courthouse, Harold handed me copies of the judgment that would forever establish the legal record of my family's behavior and its consequences. The document represented more than property ownership. It was official recognition that their years of psychological abuse and financial manipulation had been both wrong and illegal. Standing on the courthouse steps, surrounded by community members and reporters who had followed the proceedings, I realized that the truth about our family had finally emerged completely. Kenneth, Dolores, and Kristen could never again claim ignorance or innocence about their behavior. The legal system had formally recognized them as what they had always been, manipulative abusers who had exploited generosity while showing nothing but contempt for their victim. The 30-day eviction notice marked the beginning of the most satisfying month of my life, as Kenneth, Dolores, and Kristen faced the reality of their situation without the protective buffer of delusion and denial they had maintained for years. Their complete lack of preparation for this outcome revealed how thoroughly they had convinced themselves that their version of family history was accurate. Kenneth's first crisis came when he attempted to secure alternative housing and discovered that his credit rating and income level qualified him only for apartments far below the standard he had maintained while living in my house. The rental applications that required employment verification and financial references exposed the gap between his projected image and his actual circumstances. The apartment complex manager, who eventually spoke with Diana, described Kenneth's reaction to learning about security deposits, first month's rent, and credit requirements. He seemed shocked that he would need to provide proof of income and references, the manager reported. His attitude suggested he expected special treatment based on his previous living situation. But Kenneth's housing difficulties were minor compared to the financial reckoning that accompanied Judge Morrison's judgment. The court had awarded me 5 years of back rent totaling $180,000, plus legal fees, court costs, and damages for defamation and business interference. The total judgment exceeded $250,000, money Kenneth had no realistic prospect of paying. Bradford Wellington's final bill for legal representation added another $30,000 to Kenneth's financial obligations, money he had borrowed against credit cards and personal loans to fund his doomed legal challenge. His attorney's itemized billing revealed the scope of work required to mount even an incompetent defense against overwhelming evidence. Dolores's crisis was simultaneously financial and social, as her part-time boutique income was insufficient to maintain independent housing in our area. Her attempts to secure assistance from family members revealed how thoroughly Kenneth's lies had isolated her from potential support systems within our extended family. Uncle Robert's conversation with Dolores was particularly devastating, as he expressed anger about being manipulated into supporting their campaign against me. "You made me complicit in abusing someone who had been secretly supporting your family for years," he told her during a phone call that became widely known throughout our family network. Helen's response was equally harsh, focusing on Dolores's role in orchestrating this systematic humiliation campaign. "I participated in making Abigail feel unwelcome in her own home because you convinced me she was a burden," Helen reportedly said. "I'm ashamed of my behavior and disgusted by your manipulation." Kristen's social humiliation was perhaps the most complete, as her country club friends and social network learned the full extent of her participation in defrauding someone whose generosity had funded the lifestyle she had flaunted. The very people she had tried to impress with stories about Kenneth's success now understood that her designer clothes and expensive entertainment had been subsidized by someone she had systematically abused. Margaret Foster's account of Kristen's final country club appearance became legendary within our social circle. She tried to maintain her usual superiority, but everyone knew the truth about her situation, Margaret reported. When she complained about having to find a new place to live, someone actually laughed and asked if she planned to pay rent this time. But the most satisfying development was the broader community's recognition of my actual achievements and character. The contrast between their false narrative and documented reality had created a powerful story of resilience and ultimate justice that resonated throughout our professional and social networks. Business opportunities that had been delayed or canceled during their defamation campaign returned with additional referrals from people who wanted to support someone who had demonstrated such grace under pressure. The cybersecurity consulting firm experienced its most profitable quarter in company history, as clients specifically sought out my services after learning about my situation. David Chen's expanded contract became a model for how the business community rallied to support me. Your professional competence was never in question among people who actually worked with you, he explained during our contract signing. The family situation only highlighted your integrity and resilience under circumstances that would have broken most people. The property recovery process was emotionally powerful as I reclaimed my home and began removing every trace of their presence. Each room revealed evidence of how they had lived off my generosity while showing contempt for my sacrifice, from expensive purchases they couldn't afford to casual damage they had never bothered to repair. The master bedroom that Kenneth and Kristen had occupied contained evidence of the lifestyle they had maintained at my expense. Designer clothes, luxury accessories, and expensive electronics represented thousands of dollars in purchases made possible by their rent-free living situation and their access to utilities and services they had never paid for. Dolores's personal items revealed the scope of her financial irresponsibility, including credit card statements showing purchases that far exceeded her actual income. Her jewelry, artwork, and decorative objects represented an accumulated value that could have funded years of rent payments if she had lived within her actual means rather than my subsidized version of her means. But the most satisfying discovery was Kenneth's home office, where financial documents revealed the complete falseness of his projected success. Bank statements showing overdrafts, credit card balances approaching limits, and repeated late payment notices demonstrated that his confident authority about family finances had been built on complete financial incompetence. The renovation process became therapeutic as I transformed each space from their version of family luxury to my vision of personal sanctuary. Professional designers helped create environments that reflected my actual tastes and achievements rather than the accommodations I had made to avoid family conflict over the years. Harold's final legal maneuvers ensured that their financial obligations would follow them regardless of their future circumstances. Wage garnishment orders, asset liens, and credit reporting requirements created permanent consequences that would remind them daily of their behavior and its costs. The judgment was structured to maximize recovery while ensuring that they understood the connection between their actions and their consequences. Monthly payment requirements were calculated based on their actual earning capacity, making the debt manageable but persistent enough to serve as a permanent reminder of their choices. As I stood in my completely renovated home, surrounded by evidence of my actual achievements and freed from the burden of enabling their delusions, I realized that their education about reality had transformed not just their circumstances, but their understanding of themselves. They could never again claim ignorance about family dynamics or their role in creating the crisis that had destroyed their comfortable illusions. The complete victory wasn't just about property ownership or financial recovery. It was about the restoration of truth and the end of a psychological dynamic that had allowed abuse to masquerade as family loyalty. Their forced recognition of reality had liberated not just me but everyone who had been manipulated into supporting their false narrative about family relationships and personal responsibility. The transformation of my home began with exorcising every trace of their presence and creating spaces that reflected my true personality rather than the accommodations I had made to avoid family conflict. Professional interior designers helped me understand how thoroughly I had suppressed my own preferences to maintain peace with people who had never shown me genuine consideration or respect. Each room became an opportunity to express interests and aesthetic choices I had hidden for decades. The living room, where Kenneth had delivered so many condescending lectures about personal responsibility, was reimagined as a comfortable reading space filled with books on cybersecurity, business strategy, and personal growth. The dining room, where Dolores had orchestrated countless humiliation sessions disguised as family meetings, became an elegant space for entertaining friends and business associates who actually valued my company. The master bedroom renovation was particularly meaningful, as it represented the first time in my adult life that I had created a personal space without considering how family members might judge or criticize my choices. Soft blues and greens replaced the neutral colors I had chosen to avoid their comments, and artwork I had always loved but never displayed found prominent placement on walls they would never see again. But the emotional healing required more than interior design changes. Dr. Rachel Martinez, a therapist specializing in family trauma and psychological abuse, helped me understand how deeply their treatment had affected my self-perception and decision-making patterns. Our sessions revealed the extent to which I had internalized their criticisms and shaped my behavior around avoiding their disapproval. "You've spent so many years minimizing your achievements and hiding your success to avoid their resentment," Dr. Martinez observed during one of our early sessions. "Learning to celebrate your accomplishments without guilt or fear will require time and conscious effort to overcome decades of conditioning." The therapy process revealed how their systematic undermining had affected not just my family relationships, but my professional confidence and personal relationships. I had unconsciously developed habits of self-deprecation and achievement minimization that had limited my business growth and social connections for years. Diana's support during this healing process was invaluable, as she had witnessed both my professional competence and my family-induced insecurity for years. Her perspective helped me understand how dramatically different I was in business settings versus family situations, and how much energy I had wasted trying to earn approval from people who were incapable of providing it. "Watching you with clients versus watching you with your family was like seeing two completely different people," Diana reflected during one of our coffee meetings. "With clients, you're confident, decisive, and clearly in control. With your family, you became apologetic and uncertain about everything." The business expansion that followed my liberation from family drama exceeded every projection I had made during my years of constrained growth. Without the emotional drain of managing their disapproval and the time commitment of maintaining family peace, my energy and creativity returned to levels I hadn't experienced since starting my consulting firm. The cybersecurity industry was evolving rapidly, with new threats requiring sophisticated response strategies that played to my analytical strengths and technical expertise. Major contracts with healthcare systems, financial institutions, and manufacturing companies created opportunities for the kind of high-level consulting work I had always been capable of, but had been too emotionally exhausted to pursue aggressively. Austin Reed entered my life during this period of professional and personal renaissance, meeting me at a cybersecurity conference where I was presenting research on protecting small businesses from ransomware attacks. His background in enterprise software development complemented my security expertise, but more importantly, his emotional intelligence allowed him to understand my story without judgment or attempts to minimize my experience. "What strikes me about your situation is not just that you survived it, but that you maintained your integrity throughout," Austin observed during one of our early dinner conversations. "Most people would have either given up or become bitter, but you found a way to stay true to your values while protecting yourself." Austin's perspective on family relationships was refreshingly healthy, shaped by his own experience with supportive parents who had encouraged his entrepreneurial ambitions rather than undermining them. His amazement at my family's behavior helped me understand how abnormal their treatment had been, even by the standards of difficult family dynamics. The community recognition that followed the legal proceedings created opportunities for advocacy work that gave deeper meaning to my professional success. Other family financial abuse victims began seeking my consultation, not just for cybersecurity services, but for guidance on documenting their situations and protecting their assets while dealing with manipulative relatives. These consulting relationships revealed how common family financial abuse was, particularly in situations where successful individuals maintained connections with family members who resented their achievements. My experience provided a roadmap for others facing similar psychological manipulation, disguised as family obligation. One particularly meaningful case involved helping Margaret Chin, a successful real estate developer whose siblings had been systematically undermining her business relationships while claiming she was too prideful to accept family advice. The parallels to my situation were striking, and my documentation strategies helped her expose their coordinated campaign before it could destroy her professional reputation. The extended family relationships that emerged from the wreckage of my immediate family situation provided unexpected sources of connection and support. Uncle Robert and Aunt Helen, freed from Kenneth and Dolores's manipulation, reached out to rebuild relationships that had been damaged by years of false information about my character and circumstances. "We owe you apologies that can never be adequate," Robert acknowledged during our first honest conversation in years. "Kenneth convinced us that you were troubled and resentful, when the truth was that you were supporting them while they systematically abused your generosity." Helen's perspective was equally validating, as she shared observations about family dynamics she had suppressed during the years when Kenneth and Dolores controlled the narrative. "I always wondered how Kenneth could afford that lifestyle on his income," she admitted. "But questioning it seemed disloyal to family unity, so I convinced myself it wasn't my business." The romantic relationship with Austin developed naturally from professional respect to personal compatibility, unmarked by the anxiety and people-pleasing patterns that had characterized my previous attempts at dating while managing family disapproval. His presence in my life represented freedom from the emotional constraints that had limited my ability to form healthy relationships. "You don't have to earn approval in personal relationships," Austin reminded me during moments when my old patterns of overaccommodation would surface. "People who care about you want you to be yourself, not a version edited for their comfort." As the first anniversary of my legal victory approached, I reflected on the complete transformation of my life circumstances and self-understanding. The woman who had allowed her Christmas gifts to be thrown in the snow while accepting blame for family dysfunction had evolved into someone who set clear boundaries and protected her own interests without guilt or apology. The house that had been a source of conflict and manipulation became a sanctuary for authentic relationships and personal growth. Friends and colleagues who visited often remarked on the peaceful energy of spaces that had once been dominated by tension and criticism. But perhaps most importantly, I had learned to distinguish between family loyalty and self-destruction, between maintaining relationships and enabling abuse. The people who remained in my life after the legal proceedings were those capable of respecting my boundaries and celebrating my achievements rather than resenting them. The financial success that followed my emotional liberation allowed me to help other family abuse victims through scholarships, legal assistance funds, and educational programs about recognizing and responding to psychological manipulation. These activities gave purpose to my experience and created positive outcomes from years of suffering. Looking back on the Christmas morning that had started this journey, I realized that Dolores throwing my gifts in the snow had been a gift in disguise. It had forced me to confront the reality of my situation and take action to protect myself from people who would never change their behavior as long as I continued enabling it. The lesson I carried forward was both simple and profound. Sometimes the greatest kindness you can show people is refusing to participate in their delusions about reality. Kenneth, Dolores, and Kristen had needed to face the consequences of their choices, not for punishment, but for the possibility of growth that only comes from honest confrontation with truth. Today, as I write this story from my home office overlooking gardens I designed and maintained with my own resources, I want to leave you with this thought. Your worth is not determined by other people's ability to recognize it, and your success is not diminished by their failure to celebrate it. What family drama stories have you experienced in your own life? Have you ever had to set boundaries with people who claim to love you while treating you poorly? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about overcoming family manipulation and finding your authentic self. Your support helps me continue sharing these important conversations about family dynamics and personal empowerment. And remember that sometimes the best gift you can give yourself is the courage to stop accepting treatment that you would never give to someone else. Thank you for listening, and may you find the strength to protect your own peace and prosperity, no matter who tries to convince you that you don't deserve them.